Hey, it's Zax from Ready Check Pull, and I'm here to tell you about what's going on with Shadow Priest in Shadowlands. I'll go over the biggest changes from BFA and then let you know how I think the spec is going to play out overall. Okay, this one's crazy. Shadow Priest got a massive overhaul out of nowhere, so I'm going to go through the things that I think are the most important. The long story short is that Blizzard had to change Shadow because it was a balancing nightmare for them. It was the weirdest spec in the game, but also one of the coolest, so they're trying to take out the weird parts without losing the cool parts. I wasn't sold on these design changes when I first started playing with them, to be honest, but I'm completely bought in now. There's probably going to be a lot more changes to Shadow throughout the beta, but I wanted to let you know what all the hype is about, so let's get into the changes. I'm going to break the changes up into baseline stuff and talent stuff because there's just so much that's worth mentioning. The biggest thing of all is that Void form got redesigned. This was the one thing that Blizzard could not and would not ever be able to balance, so they changed it to be something more traditional. Instead of being a buff you activate and try to stay in for as long as possible, and ultimately end up being in 90% of the time, it's now a 15-second buff on a 90-second cooldown. You have to have 90 insanity to press Void Eruption and activate the cooldown, same as before, which gives you 20% more damage, the Void Bolt ability, and 2 charges of Mind Blast for the duration. But now it doesn't drain your insanity, so it's just much more straightforward now. You want to do more damage for 15 seconds, you press Void Eruption to activate Void form and go to town. But now what are you supposed to do with your insanity? That's where Devouring Plague comes in, a much loved ability that was in the game forever but got removed for Legion. It now costs 50 insanity, it's an instant cast, and it does some big upfront damage followed by some even bigger dot damage over 6 seconds. This is your only way to spend insanity outside of talents, and it does a ton of damage. Basically, the goal of the spec has become generating as much insanity as possible so that you can cast more Devouring Plagues. Feels great to me, although I'm kind of hoping it becomes stackable or something because it feels a little weird to overwrite the dot on a target when you have a lot of insanity to spend. Fingers crossed. The next big change is that shadowy apparitions have been redesigned. They're no longer based on Shadow Word Pain crits. Now they spawn from every single Mind Blast, Devouring Plague, and Void Bolt you cast, and one is sent to every single target you have Vampiric Touch on. On top of that, when those abilities crit, 2 are sent to all those targets. This means a lot more purple ghosts flying around, and they spawn more consistently. I think this spawning style is something Shadow Priests have been asking for a while, and I'm definitely enjoying it. Another big change is that Shadow Word Death is baseline again. It got stuck into the talent tree for BFA for some reason, but now it's back, and this version is crazy. You can use it at any health percentage now, but it does 175% more damage to targets under 20% health. That's a lot, but it reflects the damage back to you if the target doesn't die, like it did way back in the day. So now you kind of have to consider your own safety a little bit when you press it. I'm a big fan of getting this button back, and it even has a really cool talent interaction that I'll get to in a second. The last big baseline change is that Power Infusion is back too, another ability that's been in the game forever and now Shadow gets to enjoy it yet again. This version is a 2-minute cooldown that's castable on any target, and it gives the target a 25% haste buff for 20 seconds. So most likely you'll see Shadow Priests using this for themselves, but there is a chance you could see some crazy stuff going on with casting it on other people with their cooldowns. I think a lot of Shadow Priests are probably wishing it was only castable on themselves, so it's definitely going to be interesting to see how that meta plays out. That's it for the big baseline changes, so now let's fly through the big talent changes real quick, because this talent tree is basically unrecognizable from BFA, and it has a lot of other specs real jealous of how good it is. I'm not going to mention all the changes because I could talk about them all day, but I'll just try to summarize the biggest ones. First of all, you've got the new talent, Death and Madness, that's replacing Shadowy Insight, which basically got baked into the spec. This is the Shadow Word Death talent I mentioned earlier. It makes it so that if the target of your Shadow Word Death dies within 6 seconds, you get a bunch of insanity and the cooldown of Shadow Word Death gets reset. So for instance, when trash mobs start dying in a dungeon, you can snipe each mob with Shadow Word Death for a ton of damage and get a crazy amount of insanity from each one. You just have to be careful not to snipe yourself with the reflected damage. Definitely a go-to for dungeons. You've also got the new talent, Searing Nightmare, that's replacing Dark Void. It costs 30 insanity, it can only be used while channeling Mindseer, it does damage to everything around the Mindseer target, and also applies Shadow Word Pain to every target hit. So it's a great way to put Shadow Word Pain on everything. But more importantly, it also does double the damage to any target that already has Shadow Word Pain on it. In AoE, this ends up being a ridiculous amount of damage per insanity, way better than Devouring Plague. but it does have some downsides, like needing to be stationary for at least 2 globals to use. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing how the balancing shakes out with this one because it could be crazy. There's yet another brand new talent called Psychic Link. It causes your Mind Blast to also do 60% of its damage to every single other target you have Vampiric Touch on. This could end up being really good with certain builds depending on how much damage Mind Blast is doing, but it's also just a really cool idea. And on the last row, you've got 2 big changes. One is that Legacy of the Void has been redesigned. It now basically turns Void form into the old Void form, where it doesn't have a set duration, but it drains your insanity and ends when it gets to 0. I think Blizzard actually just left this in here for the people who really loved the old Void form. I don't think it'll ever be good in its current state because of how much damage you lose from not casting Devouring Plague, but we'll see. And the last thing, Surrender to Madness got changed yet again. Now it's got a 90-second cooldown, it instantly gives you 100 insanity and casts Void Eruption, putting you into Void form for 15 seconds, and for the next 25 seconds it doubles your insanity generation and allows you to cast while moving. However, if the target you cast Surrender on doesn't die in those 25 seconds, you die. So it's got the usual high risk, high reward choice you have to make, but with this version you can actually play it pretty safe and still get decent value from it. For instance, in a dungeon, you can cast it on a mob that doesn't have much health and you know for a fact is going to die within those 25 seconds. If that target dies 2 seconds later, you'll still get the full 15 seconds of Void form, you'll just lose the Surrender to Madness buff. I like this version of the talent a lot more, and let's be honest, it'll always be funny seeing Shadow Priests mess it up. So with all those changes, the baseline single target rotation, without cooldowns, generally boils down to maintaining Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain if the target will live for several seconds, using Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death on cooldown, spending Insanity on Devouring Plague, and filling with Mind Flay. The baseline AoE rotation is pretty similar, but instead only using Shadow Word Death on mobs below 20% health, and using Mind Seer to fill instead of Mind Flay if there are at least 3 stacked targets. So even with all the stuff I mentioned, there's still things I didn't get to. This really is a straight up overhaul, and I think it's going to be really good for Shadow Priest in the long run too. For instance, the ramp up time of the spec has gone down a lot, which means it's automatically going to be better in Mythic Plus than it has been. Its dungeon utility hasn't changed, so it's still not bad, but it's still not something that's going to carry the spec into the Mythic Plus meta. Overall though, I think we'll be seeing a lot more Shadow Priests in dungeons this expansion. As for raid viability, Shadow Priest still has the strength of being a multi-dotter, so on fights with spread cleave it'll be one of the best specs as usual. And it still has decent raid utility with Mass Dispel, Vampiric Embrace, and now Power Infusion that could go on another target. So I'd say Shadow is a relatively safe pick for having a spot in a raid group too. I can't wait to see what crazy builds people come up with for different situations because there are so many options now. I'm also excited to see what the Covenant abilities, legendaries, and soulbinds bring to the table for Shadow. Either way, I'm glad this spec is finally getting the big overhaul it's needed. Thank you to all of our supporters on Patreon for making these videos possible. If you like this little review, give us a like and feel free to check out any of the other specs I cover. And let me know in the comments or in our Discord which specs you want to know about next. Links to everything in the description. See you next time.